Ron Paul was a Republican presidential candidate in 2008 and 2012, and the Libertarian Party presidential candidate in 1988. He served in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1976 to 1977, from 79 to 85, and from 97 to 2013. One of the country's most ardent defenders of freedom, peace, free markets, and sound money, Paul has long been a fierce critic of the Federal Reserve System, the IRS, the war on drugs, socialism, empire, interventionism, and the national security establishment. He has also been an ardent defender of civil liberties and a vocal critic of the USA Patriot Act, torture, indefinite detention, and NSA surveillance programs. A graduate of Gettysburg College and Duke University School of Medicine, Paul was a practicing obstetrician and gynecologist from the 60s through the 80s. The founder of the Ron Paul Institute, Paul is the author of several books on Austrian economics and classical liberalism, among which are The Case for Gold, A Foreign Policy of Freedom, In the Fed, Pillars of Prosperity, The Revolution, A Manifesto, Swords into Plowshares, and Define Liberty. And I might add, he is an absolute personal hero of, I think, every libertarian in the libertarian movement, especially me. The title of Ron's talk is Enemies, Foreign and Domestic. Please welcome Ron Paul.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bumper, and thank you for inviting me. You know, when I was back in Washington, I would give occasional speeches. I'd take time on a special order. You could get time, 5 minutes, sometimes even up to an hour. And the one thing that happened with those speeches, I did my very best, but I never had any applause. So, so I'm glad to come here, and I get a little applause once in a while. So I need to boost my ego. But Bumper, it's great that you put this together. This is fantastic. And this organization, the Future of Freedoms Foundation, a great organization. If you support it, and you should, because Bumper, it's really good. The only thing is I have a little bit of question about him. He has all these fantastic speakers and intellectuals, and then he went and invited a politician to come. So I don't know about that. But I want to tell you, though, Bumper, you did have a little competition for me to get here. I had this other invitation. It was really a tough choice. There was a meeting held, matter of fact, in the area. It was over in Chantilly. I don't know if you know what's going on over in Chantilly. But, you know, I was tempted to do that. But then again, I got to thinking it would be much better to be among friends and feel safe and secure, because at that other place I might not have felt so safe. But, no, it is great to be here. And, of course, the title of my talk is, you know, defending and support the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Of course, many people take that oath, and sometimes they get a little bit confused on that, because when I went to Washington, I thought I had a pretty good understanding about the Constitution. But then, you know, we would go back and forth. It turned out that my understanding was completely wrong, and they tried to convert me. But I had a little trouble listening to their arguments. They told me something about the Constitution should be more flexible, and it should be a living document. It shouldn't be overly rigid, and that's how you get into trouble. So I sort of struggled with that tremendously, and then I got to thinking, you know, one compliment that I get, that I don't mind getting this, because I think sometimes the compliments are embellished a little bit more than it need to be. But the one is that, how did you go there? How did you put up with that nonsense and not have to join the gang? Because I was there for close to 24 years, and of course, the one thing is my goals were different. My goal wasn't to be the chairman of the committee, because to do that, you know, you have to sell your soul, you have to raise money, a few minor little things like that. So in my case, I I do believe that when people say about me not joining the gang, it's true. Matter of fact, the longer I was there, the more I became very skeptical of government per se, and I became more rigidly determined that the problem's not with the people as much as it is with the government, and the government is just way too big, too intrusive, and you have all this nonsense going on, and that is the reason I believe that it's important that we stick to our principles and not say, well, a little bit of government here, a little bit of the government there. So for that reason, I left Congress much more adamant being opposed to big government than the motivation I had to go to Congress. But, you know, I think the whole issue, we talk about all that's going on today and in foreign policy, and the bickering that goes on. There's a lot of that. But the bickering that we hear, from my viewpoint, has nothing to do with the important issue, and that has to do with philosophy. I don't believe there's, you know, two parties. I believe there's only one party there, and I think bipartisanship is very bad. I think coalitions are okay, but bipartisan, everything gets done by bipartisanship. The two parties have to agree with everything that's been done for the 50 years. They agree on funding and not even examining these security budgets and the CIA. They don't. It's always bipartisan. Going to war. Just let them go to war and we'll finance them. So it's always a bipartisanship. But those, I frequently would get the criticism that I'm overly rigid. And depends on what you're rigid about, depends on whether it's good or not. But I remember one time there was one of the members of Congress said, well, he was working to get a credentials that he was against corporate welfare. So the Export-Import Bank appropriation was coming up. So he wanted to cut it 5%, which meant nothing. And we had to vote, and it didn't pass. No way would dare, you know, cut the Export-Import Bank. So the next vote I wanted to abolish the Export-Import Bank. So I supported the other gentleman's, you know, amendment to cut it a little bit, but he wouldn't support mine. So I went up to him and I said, "Hey, look, I thought you were against this stuff. Why aren't you voting with this?" He says, "Ron, your trouble is you always just go too far." But I think this is one of the problems, whether it's foreign policy or domestic policy. If you concede the principle, I think you concede 100% of it. So if you say that we have to do such and such type of welfare program, or a little bit of war, a little bit of intervention, you concede this whole principle that we're supposed to do it. So I do think, although it's a goal that won't be easily achieved, you should take this principle, and much has been said today about non-interventionism. And I love that term, because non-interventionism tells you what liberty is all about. And it would go a long way for foreign policy as well. That we should be, if we believe in the cause of liberty, we should be non-interventionists. We should have a government that does not intervene in peaceful activity of all citizens. Just let us mind our own business. And, of course, we should have a government that, if you believe in markets, you should have a non-interventionist government that doesn't try to regulate the economy. And just think of the thousands and thousands of pages of regulations that go on. So it's too much intervention. And, of course, in foreign policy, it's way overblown, way too much intervention. But, you know, there was a time when it really bothered me when you started reading, you know, revisionist history, because it challenged me, quite frankly, when I started reading a little bit about the lead-up to World War II, and that there was supposedly knowledge, possibly, of what was going to happen at Pearl Harbor. I just didn't want to believe that about my government. And so it took a long time to sort of soften my stand on that. But the same way, I was drafted in 1962 during the Cuban crisis, which was discussed here today. And then I was actually inducted into the service in the early 1961. I was the flight surgeon at the airport in San Antonio the day before Kennedy was killed. And I was in charge of the medical provision there. But there was no way at that time, when the assassination occurred, that I would say, you know, our government may well have been involved. I wouldn't want to hear any part of that. And of course, you know, things like, you know, the shooting up of the Liberty is one thing, and what about 9/11 Commission? But I've come to a conclusion. I'll just see if you think this is a pretty good assessment. I think commissions are great. Have commissions, study all this, because when they're done, they really help you out if you're looking for truth. Look at what they've said and decide exactly the opposite is the truth. We would have frequent briefings after 9/11. We had plenty, and there were briefings all the time to